course, like any sizable predator, the raven also needs a good deal of space in order to nest and hunt to survive. And once this bird has established its territory, it has to see off rivals of its own species, as well as other raptors like buzzards and peregrines that seek out similar habitats and prey. Because ravens quite often nest in a large tree, or like here, on a rocky crag on the edge of a cliff. And of course, they usually have about 4 or 5 chicks in a brood, and the male and female will each take it in turns to feed the young. Of course, ravens have always been associated with myth and legend. In fact, probably the most famous examples of it are Odin, who was the Norse god of war, and he was always accompanied by ravens. But also in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, the dwarves of Erebor used ravens to contact their kin in the Iron Hills. And probably the most famous examples were in Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Ravens were used to send messages to the people of Westeros, but also there was the three-eyed raven, which, believe it or not, George R.R. Martin ripped off from Norse mythology. But probably the most famous example is Edgar Allan Poe's whose poem The Raven, which was written in 1845. Of course, I've seen ravens a fair few times in the wild over the years, and to me they are one of the most peaceful birds in the world, and they are probably my favourite member of the crow family. And to me they are absolutely breathtaking creatures. Of course, here is their range. Of course, unfortunately, the raven is in decline mainly around the Scottish border country and here in Northumberland. That's mainly down to what they call more efficient sheep rearing practices that are leaving fewer carcasses for the ravens to feed on. Now, from birds back to mammals, this next one is probably one of our most endearing mammal. It is the otter. Now, otters are in the weasel family, so that's the same family as weasels, stoats, badgers and wolverines. Of course, they are aquatic animals, which means they are also found in fresh water and salt water, and like all members of the weasel family, they may look cute and cuddly, but trying to give one a cuddle would be a very nasty idea, because, like I said, they are in the weasel family, and so they do have a dark side with canine teeth about the length of my little finger and formidable bone-crunching teeth. And, of course, male otters are always bigger than females, and of course they usually command a territory, a very big territory with the best feeding grounds, and they can quite often have more than one mate at a time. But also, otters will feed on a wide range of prey, not just fish, but also amphibians, reptiles, crustaceans, and even birds. In fact, they will take pretty much anything they can catch. And of course, believe it or not, otters were actually once nearly extinct from Britain in the 1960s, because they were wiped out by hunting for their fur, but also pollution of the waterways where they lived. However, around the 1980s, they started to make a comeback, as they were reintroduced to the rest of Britain, and they are slowly making a recovery. One of their strongholds is in Scotland. Of course, I first saw otters in the wild about about 14 years ago at the Attenborough Nature Reserve in Derbyshire, where I actually caught a fleeting glimpse of otters. But when I went to the Isle of Mull off the west coast of Scotland in 2017 with my mother, we actually got to see dozens of otters, and that was the best week of my life, really. And of course, as you can see, otters can go underwater. Of course, when they're underwater, they mostly use their sensitive whiskers to detect the wake of fish. And of course, I've seen these animals in the wild in Scotland, and of course, as I mentioned, I really would not advise trying to give an otter a hug, because you'd probably end up losing a few fingers and having to have some stitching in your body. Even so, they are one of the most beautiful animals in Britain. In fact, here is their range in Britain. Now, for our largest bird of prey, the white-tailed sea eagle. Now, the white-tailed eagle is the largest bird of prey in the British Isles. And when I say the largest, I mean a fully grown female could have a wingspan of just over 2 meters long, which is as long as me standing with my hands in the air. They can have a beak like a butcher's cleaver, and they have talons that are formidable. And of course, their characteristic white tail, which is pure white, whereas their head can be like a dull white. Of course, white-tailed eagles, like their name suggests, they feed mainly on fish, but they will also take seabirds, waterfowl, as well as mammals like rabbits, and even something as big as a fox or a deer. And of course, the white-tailed eagle was wiped out from Britain in the 1940s, but in the 1970s they were reintroduced to Scotland from Scandinavia, and they have since then been making a recovery. In fact, in 2019 there was actually a reintroduction programme on the Isle of Wight on the south of Scotland. Well, not the south of Scotland, I mean the south of England, where five 4-year-old birds were reintroduced. And they have slowly been spreading across England and into Wales. Now, of course, when I was a kid, I always believed that the white-tailed eagle was one of our most magnificent birds. I didn't get to see a white-tailed sea eagle in the wild until I was in my mid-teens, when I went to the Isle of Mull off the west coast of Scotland with my mum, because we went on a boat trip on our second day where we actually went to see wildlife along the coastline, and I actually got to see my first white-tailed sea eagles in the wild. And of course, what I saw 2 adults with one fairly well-developed youngster starting to fly, and I was at the front of the boat, with my camera, with my big lens, taking photos, and one of the crew guys, he actually had his hand on my shoulder, steadying me to stop me from falling into the sea, which was quite nice of him. And of course, my mum was at the top of the boat, and she said that I was mentioned by one of the crew. But yeah, of course, not everyone has been in favour of our largest bird of prey coming back to the rest of Britain, but a lot of them are just idiots as well, and most of them are farmers who caused these birds to go extinct in the first place, and they are just going to have to deal with it. This is their range in Scotland. But around here was the journeys that the eagles released on the Isle of Wight off the south coast of England have made since 2019. Some of them have even started breeding in the south of England as well. Now, for the next animal, it's one of our most elusive and also one of our most charismatic animals, the badger. Now, badgers are probably our largest carnivore. Well, when I say carnivore, I mean badgers will eat pretty much anything. They're more omnivores than carnivores. I mean, most of what they eat is berries, fruits, as well as earthworms, insects, insect larvae, beetles, woodlice, and of course they will eat small mammals like voles, rats, mice, and even rabbits, and possibly even young deer. And of course, they are one of the most well-known creatures in Britain. I mean, from that black and white face. I mean, the facial markings are all down to how badgers recognise each other, because badgers don't have very good eyesight, but they have a very, very keen sense of smell and hearing. And of course, their sense of smell is said to be probably 1,000 times more powerful than ours, and so they can smell an easy meal from miles away. But also, badgers tend not to live alone. They usually live in large colonies in dens that are called setts. And of course, they can usually consist of a whole network. Like one is for shelter, the other's for socialising, another's for sleeping, and the other is for raising cubs. Of course, I've seen badgers multiple times over the years. Because where my grandparents lived down in Yeovil in Somerset, they actually live right on the edge of a woodland, and for many years they've been feeding the badgers there by leaving peanuts as well as scraps from the dinner table out in the evenings for them, and quite often the badgers pick up the scent and they come trundling along from the wood and into the garden. Of course, when I was little, I always said badgers are just so cute and cuddly. And of course, my grandpa, he actually said, like, if I tried to give a badger a cuddle, I would probably end up getting ripped to shreds. Because these animals are in the weasel family, and they have a very formidable side to them. I mean, they have incredibly powerful claws and ferocious teeth. I mean, there's no doubt if I was to go up against a badger, it would probably shred me. But unfortunately, badgers are also one of the most heavily threatened of all British animals. And one of the main reasons for that is that thousands of badgers are killed by cars on roads every year. But even worse is badger culls, because badgers are always blamed for breakouts of bovine TB. Of course, they're blamed by cattle farmers who say that the sets of badgers need to be tracked down so they can be culled. In other words, which is both inhumane, absolutely stupid, and does not work at all. Because if they kill one set of badgers, then another will just take over, and it's not always the badgers that are responsible for the spread of bovine TB. And fortunately, thanks to the work of people like Brian Cox, who is the guitarist of Queen, but also a very well-known badger activist, he has been able to tell people that badgers need protection, not culling. And also, with his help, vaccinations, better prices of vaccinations for TB are being given to cattle, so it can, and also to vaccinations to the badgers, which has helped them stop stop most of the spreading of TB.